There are people, trees, oceans, seas, and animals in this world, but there's one thing missing. What is it? Money. So how did people fill their stomachs? In today's video, we're going to go so far back in time that you'll be confused about whether humanity was better off before money existed, or worse. Because for more than 95% of human history, there was no such thing as money. No credit cards, no interest, no loans, nothing existed. Instead, we'll talk about what did. And you know what? In this series we're going to cover the entire history of money, before money, the invention of money, and everything from then up to today, and you're going to be shocked by what you learn. Because in school they taught you this: first there was barter, then money was invented. In this episode, you'll see just how wrong that story really is. If you're ready, let's begin. What was hunter-gatherer life like? Here's one of the strangest facts about the world: as a species, we've only existed for 300,000 years. And within those 300,000 years, we only started farming 12,000 years ago. That's a pretty startling fact. So let me put it another way. If you compress the timeline into 24 hours, the invention of agriculture happens at 11:04 p.m., meaning for more than 23 hours of that day, people lived as hunter-gatherers. In other words, the thing we call money was a strange tool humanity never even knew about for most of its existence. I can almost hear you wondering, so how did these people actually live? These people, who thought their world was infinite and had no idea what lay even a few kilometers beyond where they stood, moved around in small groups, usually somewhere between 15 and 50 people at most. This small group size actually made the invention of money even less likely. Why? Because when so few people live together constantly, everyone knows everyone else's children, siblings, and grandparents. Today, many of us don't even know our next-door neighbor's name, but in that world, these small groups had no choice but to know each other intimately. This small group would hunt together, maybe fish together, or gather food that grew wild in the fields. Here's the really interesting part: according to scientific research, these people worked only about 3.5 hours a day. Because once they'd eaten, drunk, and filled their stomachs, nothing else mattered. There were no credit card bills to pay, no loans to pay off, no houses to buy. They spent the rest of their time resting, chatting, or telling each other stories, sometimes making tools, sometimes making just enough clothing to cover their needs. This might sound pretty cool and relaxing, but of course life back then wasn't actually that easy. They constantly had to stay alert against wild animals, and sometimes major diseases, or epidemics that would be considered minor today but were devastating back then simply because there was no treatment, or famines, meant life was nearly at its end for them. When you think about their problems compared to ours today: how am I going to pay off this loan? My rent went up again, the grocery bill shocked me again this month. I wonder whose life you think is actually harder. So how did they share? Do you think sharing was easy back when money didn't exist yet? Because this is really the crux of it. Now I want you to imagine yourself as a hunter. You worked hard today and caught a big deer. You realize there's more meat than you and your family could possibly eat. What do you do with the rest? Most likely, you share it. And chances are, you don't ask for anything in return, because it's simply surplus to you. Today, economists call this a gift economy. And the logic of the system works like this: today I give you meat, next week you give me fruit, next month maybe your neighbor makes you a tool. Nobody kept a ledger of the gifts they gave or the surplus in their home. In other words, no one said, I gave you 1 kilogram of meat yesterday, so you owe me 1 kilogram tomorrow. The whole system ran entirely on trust. This might not make immediate sense to you, but there's actually a very clever strategy underlying it. Because hunting isn't a job where you go out every morning and are guaranteed to come back with an animal. Think of it as a profession that's almost entirely based on luck. If today happens to be a day you couldn't catch anything, because you gave your neighbor a gift yesterday, your neighbor can share their catch with you if they succeed. And this way, no one goes hungry. Economists today call this risk pooling. But hundreds of thousands of years ago, people were already doing this without knowing its scientific name. In fact, you know what? The logic underlying what we call banking today is essentially this same idea. Here's an even more interesting fact. When anthropologists studied Stone Age economies, they classified this era as the first society of abundance. When most of us think of the Stone Age, we imagine people living in caves, unable to find anything to wear. But actually, they weren't constantly on the edge of starvation as we assume. They were communities that met their needs with very little labor and lived in genuine abundance and wealth. Because wealth isn't really about how much money you have in hand, and given that money didn't even exist in this era, and considering that people could meet their needs and receive gifts from neighbors whenever they went hungry, they were arguably among the wealthiest societies in history. I wonder what you think: did the invention of money make us richer or poorer? In the next part, we'll see how the feeling of reciprocal exchange between people started to develop, and things are about to get even more complicated. Did barter even really exist? Now, with the information I'm about to give you, you're going to forget everything you thought you knew about economic history. Because in school, they taught you that humans first started with barter before money existed, that you'd give me a chicken and I'd give you wheat in return, that kind of cooperation. Then they said that bartering became inconvenient, and as trading wheat for chickens started to seem impractical over time, money was invented. But you know what? This barter story is a massive myth. Because this story, first written down in 1776, was taught in textbooks for 200 years, yet modern anthropologists have never found a single society anywhere in the world that ran on pure barter. According to the most recent research, no society has ever been found whose economy operated purely on barter. So what's the real story, you might be wondering? Let me explain. People living within the same community didn't trade goods with each other, because, as I mentioned earlier, they were already gifting each other their surplus. What we call barter didn't happen within a community, it happened between different communities, among groups who didn't know each other and had no trust relationship. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine one tribe encountering a new tribe for the first time. If that new tribe had surplus salt, they might trade it for however much leather they needed from the other tribe, in proportion to the salt given. And this wasn't a common, everyday occurrence, it happened only in exceptional circumstances. So saying that barter was the foundation of the economy before money is a huge misconception. Because relationships back then were all built on trust, and trustless exchange between strangers only happened in emergencies. Why does this matter? So, in short, my friends, underneath today's multi-trillion-dollar financial system, there's no money at its core, just trust and debt. For example, when you lend a friend money and say pay me back later, you're essentially living out a small version of that gift economy I mentioned earlier. As one famous anthropologist put it, money was born not as a solution to barter, but out of the need to keep record of debt relationships. In other words, before money, people relied on trust, not barter. Later, as that trust gradually eroded, people invented money to make it something concrete. I wonder, what do you think it would be like to live in a world where money was never invented? Would it have been better? Write your thoughts in the comments. This is a series, so stay tuned for part 2. In the next episode, we'll talk about the transition to settled life, humans giving up nomadism to settle on land. And let me tell you something right now, the reason people transitioned to settled life wasn't, as you might think, to live more comfortably. In fact, according to some researchers, this transition might be one of the biggest mistakes in human history. It may have negatively affected the average person's health, nutrition, and even height. Why? I'll explain that in part 2. Don't miss it.